Hi, my name is Chris Curzon, and this is my presentation for DJS08 talking about the React router. I'm going to read through the questions and try to explain them one by one, and then show you the required piece on the code base and how that's interpreted. So for the first question, there's three main points that we want to cover. What is the purpose of using React router or in a React application? How do we set that up? And describing the role of the routes and the route component in defining the navigation structure. So answering the first question and how that ties in here, it's that it allows us to create a single page application, which means that when the browser loads our application, it is never really refreshed or navigated away from unless explicitly stated. This is the most common use. But when we navigate to our links or our components, it updates the URL in the browser and loads the components or renders the components that we expect to see at these places. We can see this looking at the code. The way that it's laid out is that just like a regular static server would set up its semantic navigation structure, you've got a root element, an about page, a Vans page, a Vans ID, and this accepts a parameter. We've got a login page and then a host page that's got further nested routes inside of it. So just like a regular server, we nest our routes depending on path, and then we can travel there. But instead of it having to do a request to the browser every single time, instead the application intercepts that request, updates it inside the URL at the top, and then renders the component that we define at each of these routes. So setting up the router is, as I've shown you, you have to use the router as pretty much the top level component in your app. For my case, I used the hash router, not the browser router, because it allowed me to specify a relative path, even though I use my base name as root. Because I host my server at a different location than the actual root of the server, with browser router, I had the implication that it would navigate to the routes defined as static routes, so it would always end up at the wrong place. But using the hash router, I did not have that problem, because it would just host at the root directory that I give it, and then everything after the hash isn't really used as a navigation component, not technically, but the app still intercepts it and then can go to the appropriate places. So that's why I chose to use hash router over browser router, but in most scenarios they work exactly the same. And for your deployment or your production app, you'd probably prefer browser router if it's hosted at the root level of your server, so that you get better SEO rankings, because most SEO engines doesn't like seeing a hash in the URL, because it means everything after the hash is never really sent to the server, so it only sees a single page, which is what it actually is, but it doesn't get to see what the different navigation components are. But anyway, I digress. So our routes is our top level component in which we nest our little routes one by one, and this intercepts, because we can give a location for the routes element as well, to tell it from which point we want to start defining our individual routes like this. But because we don't, it is going to intercept at the root level of the application. So we only need one routes, and I think most scenarios will only ever use one routes element with multiple route elements nested inside of it. And this is the layout of our navigation tree. Like I said, this mimics a proper static server, as you'd see with vanilla HTML and serving static pages. So getting to question 2, the application of route parameters and nested routes. We want to know is what are route parameters and how are they used in React Router, including the use of use parameters to access these parameters, and then discuss the concept of nested routes, and then provide an example. Okay, so route parameters allows us to essentially create dynamic links. So for instance, if I have to use this as an example, over here we have well, both of these actually have a route specified that isn't hard coded. So Vans, for instance, is a hard coded URL, but the double dot ID is not. What it in fact is any kind of query string that's added after Vans will be intercepted by the application and provided to us as a parameter that we can use to fine tune whatever we render for the user. So in most scenarios this is used, so you'd have a general product template and then you would pass it something like a product ID, which it then fetches, and then based on that specific product it will render you the data that you want to look at. The reason why this is a good thing to do, it's because it allows you to create dynamic URLs. You don't have to statically code every single URL for every single possible product that you might want to display. Instead, it allows you to programmatically do that. So you can just give the abstract version of what you want to do without having to implement it for every single route. So an example of this is over here in our details page, where we allow van ID to pass into the route, and then we will grab that, and then based on that we're going to show you a very specific van. So let me maybe just show you on the website first. So if we go to Vans, we can see all the Vans, and if I click one of them, it navigates to a specific ID of the van. Now this has been hard-coded inside of the app, each of the van IDs and the links to them. But inside of the code, what happens is we use this little function imported from route reactor, use parameters, and it gives us access to whatever the user has typed in here. So I can maybe put in something like 2, and it's going to give me something else. So anything that we type in, any kind of ID that we type in, it's going to pull up that element for us. So using the route parameters variable, we can use that to conditionally render the kind of thing. So in this instance, we use that parameter ID to fetch a specific data source. Well, we go to our data sources and we search for a specific product, get back that data, and then inject it into the template to display to the user. And then our next question is nested routes, and how do they benefit the structure of the React application? So nested routes are a very, very powerful thing. It allows us to successively build out the UI by having a shared layout component. So this header bar, for instance, is something that's always going to be in the app, as well as the footer. This little upper search bar here is also something that's going to be shared regardless of what we inject in here. And what the nested routes allows us to do is define the structure of how that layout is going to be, and we make space for it in the code using the outlet component that's also provided by the React DOM. So an example of this is if we go to one of the layout pages, like let's go to the host layout, for instance. We have a nav link here that allows us to, so if I go to the host page, this is a nav link bar that allows us to look at different sections of the host's page, but it is shared among all of them, and we can render the individual links through this outlet component down here. We can show different things. So it allows us to build a consistent user interface, so we don't have to recreate the entire interface for every link that we go to. Instead, we only have to define the specific component that we need to change at that point in time, and then render it through the outlet. They want to see an example, such as the configuration for nested routes. So yeah, again, looking at the app configuration, the most simple way to use a route is when it's just a single line like this, that's a self-closing tag referencing its path and its element. But if you want to nest that and make use of the outlet element, you create an open close route. So you've got an opening tag here, you've got a closing tag here, and inside of it you specify what are the different things that you want to render inside of it. In this specific case, we have a route here that's only acting as an interceptor that looks at conditional authentication logic. It doesn't have a path by itself, but anytime you try to go to one of these paths, it will hit this route first, run the logic in that component before deciding to render the next set of links. Same thing if you go down to host, it's going to run the logic to get down there, it's going to render that component, and then give you these options. And then as you can see in the UI, depending on what you click, it's going to decide what it wants to show to you. So if we go to the host layout, which is that component, which I've got over here, it's just the nav link that we've got at the top, and the outlet allows us to dynamically specify what we want to show, so we don't have to code this page over and over again. Okay, question 3, the implementation of navigation controls and dynamic linking. So they're asking, how does the link component enhance navigation with a React application? So the link component, it renders a regular anchor tag in HTML on the application, but instead of it working like a regular anchor tag, the React application or the React router application will intercept this link, change the URL in the query bar at the top, and then navigate you to that page, but not a regular navigation. Instead, it just renders the component at that space. So these routes are how we define the layout of the application. And looking at this, for instance, so these are nav links, they're a little spicier than a regular link, but they do the same things essentially. So they just tell us where we want to go. Instead of having to render a regular anchor tag, we can use this to make our life easier. For instance, using the to, this is how we link it to the routes that we've set up in our application. And the main thing that you need to know about them is that they intercept the call to the server. So it doesn't navigate you away from the page like a regular anchor tag would. Instead, it's intercepted by the application and you are rendered the route that you ask for using that link. Unless, of course, you specify otherwise, saying that I do want to reload the page, or it's something that points to outside of your application that you don't have control over, in which fact it needs to make a call to the server. But I don't think you'd use a link for that kind of functionality. You'd probably just use a regular anchor tag. Next question, describe the use of a nav link for active styling. What makes a nav link different from a basic link component? So the main thing that makes a nav link different is that its class name and its style properties can accept a function, where a link can only accept a static object. And the reason why we do this is because, so this is a good example. So let me maybe just find you a regular link, I think in the header. Yes, we've got a regular link here that's got a class name, but it just takes in a regular string, which is a regular object in JavaScript. But the nav link siblings takes in a function that I've defined up here. Now, this function is accepting what's a destructured parameter that we throw in here. So when you pass this function to the style or the class name components of a nav link, it gives you access to a property object that gives you context of the status of the nav link. There are 3 statuses. There's a active, rendering, or busy, and loading, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but there's different statuses that gives you context of what's happening with the link. And then most often you'll use the isActive property, like this application, for example, uses the isActive property to apply a conditional style on those links. So what we do for this app is where we are, so our current location inside the navigation tree is going to be underlined and bolded. So wherever we navigate to, this allows us to see where we are at. Like normally, if you don't do this, you won't really have an idea where you're at unless you're very familiar with the application you're working with. But this just makes it very easy for you to see where you are and makes navigation a better user experience overall. So it's a regular link, but it just gives you an additional functionality to do some conditional rendering and adding some extra features based on its context and its state, essentially. The last question is, discuss the use of search parameters and the use search parameters hook to dynamically filter content. So the search parameters, it allows, let me just go to a place where we use that. So over here in Vans, when we look at Vans, for instance, we've got some filter parameters up here, and we can use that. We can see at the URL bar, there's a question mark, which tells the browser that these are search query parameters. That's your key and that's your value, and you can have multiple ones specified, like split with an ampersand. You can add in many different values there. So let's do rugged. So I'm just changing it via the URL. So like I said, what that does, what this function allows us to do is to get a reference to these query parameters, and then we can do a conditional render based on what they were. So in this instance, there are three things, actually four things that we care about for our van page. The first one is we just want to see everything. That's just the regular state, so there's no query parameters, and we can see all of the vans that's displayed. But if I want to filter by rugged or luxury or simple, I can just click that. That's added into the URL. The component that renders now has access to these search parameters through the use search parameters function. We've statically defined type as a keyword. We grab it over here, and then based on what that filter is, we are now going to use that over here. We've got the logic that says based on that type filter, we are going to selectively decide what we are going to render. So it's just a way of allowing you to decide what to render based on some query keywords. And the use of query parameters, if it's implemented in a functional manner, will provide a consistent user experience. So what I mean by that is, if it's done in a way that doesn't include any side effects, we can copy this URL and give it to someone else, where we just add that in, and it's going to display to them exactly the same things that we expected to see. So setting it up in a method that is functional allows you to have a consistent user experience based on what you share and what you expect to see. I think that covers all of the questions we've been asked to answer, so I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out, and thank you. See you on the next one.